candy. Mouse pad. Strings, 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 picks. So that was about a 2-month supply of strings. In today's video, I'm going to be talking about how often you should change your guitar strings. First, we need to establish that there are 2 main reasons why you would want to change your strings. Number 1, because they're rusted out, and number 2, because they're worn out. First, let's talk about factors that would contribute to strings rusting out. So, one factor would be the climate in which you store the guitar. Basically, the more humidity that you expose your guitar to, the faster the strings are going to rust. I've noticed that without even playing a guitar once, if I keep my guitars in a humidity controlled environment, where I usually do, the strings will last months without rusting. Whereas I've taken my guitars to a very humid area, and the strings, without even touching them to play them, will rust in a matter of days. The other factor that contributes to rust is a combination of the playing time that you have on the strings and your own personal sweat. Now, I know people who can play the same set of strings for a long time, people who practice regularly, and for some reason for them, the strings don't seem to rust out. For me, on the other hand, even if I'm not necessarily pouring with sweat when I'm playing, although sometimes I am, even if I'm playing and my hands feel dry and just normal the entire time, something about my natural oils or sweat of my hand seems to really corrode guitar strings pretty quickly. My strings will start to corrode after about 10 hours of average playtime. So they'll start to corrode right away, but after about 10 hours they'll get to the point where you'll see like a dark spot on certain frets for certain patterns where I was playing, and it becomes sticky. So I can't perform slides very well, and I have to change the strings just as a performance issue. Not that they're solid rust by that point. So on the guitar that I use the most practicing, I have to change the strings about once a week, just because they just get too rough to be easily playable. And then out of all my other guitars, usually 1 or 2 per week I'll have to restring, because either from light use, if it's one of my guitars that I play in an alternate tuning, or just over time they started to rust. So typically I do about 2 or 3 restrings per week constantly. Now let's talk about the other factor as to why you would want to change your guitar strings, which is that the strings themselves are worn out tonally. So let's say you just restrung your guitar, you have a brand new, fresh set of strings on it. Now, if those strings are perfectly new, the metal is new, the strings are going to sound really sharp. Like, they're going to sound cutting, they're going to sound clear. You'll especially notice this if you've ever tried to record anything with new strings versus strings that have been played for a while. New strings on a recording are going to sound as clear as possible, and you're going to like that. And if you try to record something with strings that you've played on for a week, then they're going to sound significantly duller than if you had new strings on. So whenever I go to record something, I always make sure I have either brand new, or maybe I've played them one time, but I don't want to have my strings sound dull on recording. And even if you're one of those people who doesn't sweat a lot when you play and your strings just never seem to rust for a long time, you're going to notice after a period of time that your strings are going to sound really, really lifeless. They're not going to be vibrant sounding when you're practicing even. At that point, the metal of the string has been stretched and retuned and stretched and retuned and stretched and retuned, and it's basically not able to sound how it should sound. So at that point, you're going to want to change your strings even if they're not rusty, just so that they sound good to your ear. And for each person, that point is going to be different. So it'll depend on the number of hours total that you've practiced, and your playing style. So the harder you play, the more you typically stretch your strings out, the faster they're going to sound dull. So basically what you should take from this is that there is not a concrete timeline that somebody should change their strings. It'll depend on a lot of variables. It'll depend on rust and how much your strings are worn out audibly. And each person is going to tolerate both of those factors more or less than anybody else. I think as you become a more high performance player, you will tolerate things like rust very little, and you're going to want to change your strings if they even become slightly of a drag, because you don't want to get your hands stuck to do something complex. But if you're just starting out and you're learning like first position chords, it's not going to be a huge factor for you, but you should keep it in mind. And also, the longer you've been playing, the more critical of an ear you're going to have, so that will apply to your strings wearing out tonally as well. You're not going to want to tolerate strings that sound really dull. But for each person it's going to be different, for each climate, for each instrument, for each playing style, for each person's own sweat, it's going to be different. But I think it's important to be aware of all of those factors and to make sure you're not leaving your strings on for too long and making it harder on yourself by making your guitar either play worse or sound worse than it needs to. As always, thank you for watching. If you like this video, please share it and subscribe to my channel for more guitar and music related content. Thank you.